from India, from Japan, from Poland, from Croatia, from Portugal, from Brazil, and say the things that you tell about in Pescina, in Italy, happen here in Croatia, in Ukraine, in Japan. They happen here every day.
The Americans apparently used his book. Was it only his book, or the other, the Fontamaro, or the other books?
And perhaps
for
Bread and Wine.
Bread and Wine. What did they do?
Well, during the Second World War, they realized that the books could be used to further the Allied cause and try to defeat fascism and Nazism. So they had the books translated in not very good quality translations, very cheaply done, and distributed by the thousands to Allied soldiers who were just about, perhaps, let's say, in North Africa or maybe someplace else, waiting to invade Italy. So that Allied soldiers would have an idea exactly what fascism was all about.
Well, after he became famous with this book, obviously many European writers, even American writers, recognized him as a major writer.
Right.
Faulkner.
The book, as we said, was translated, and obviously it was translated into English, and people like William Faulkner and others, Graham Greene, wrote reviews, literally put him on the map, on the literary stage, and it became an international bestseller. And
he never won any Nobel Prize for it.
No, he didn't win a Nobel Prize, but from what I understand, twice in the 1970s he was considered for the Nobel Prize in Literature. When Albert Camus won the Nobel Prize for Literature, he said in an interview that this Nobel Prize in Literature really should have gone to Silone.
Anyway, and what about the second book that he wrote, Bread and Wine?
The second book
also deals with his native Abruzzi.
Right. The Bread and Wine, Pane e Vino, which is what I think most critics would consider to be his finest novel, his most fully developed novel, concerns the story of Pietro Spina, who is in many ways actually very autobiographical. It's based on Silone. He's a disillusioned communist intellectual who has come back into Abruzzo from exile to sort of gauge the possibility of an anti-fascist uprising against the regime. And in order to avoid being arrested by the fascist police, he disguises himself as a Catholic priest. And Pietro Spina becomes Paolo Spada.
Didn't this become a movie?
I think it was filmed, yes. Fontamara became a movie, and I think Bread and Wine also became a movie in the 1960s or 1970s.
The one book that I became interested, I didn't even know that it existed, is the School for Dictators. Obviously, that's not a creative, that was an essays.
It was actually a satire. It was first published in the 1930s after Nazism had come to power, and it concerns an American who wants to become a dictator in the United States and his sidekick, a university professor, who go to Europe as a kind of pilgrimage to find out what would it take to become a fascist dictator in the United States. And one of the people they go to visit is this exiled Italian intellectual in Switzerland who is based on Silone. And it is, Silone said, his most insightful book or analysis of what exactly the phenomenon, the ideology of fascism was.
Mm-hmm. Of course, Silone was very much against the dictatorships.
He was against dictatorships in all its forms. That's why he was both anti-fascist and anti-communist.
Usually, it is regular that the fascists were anti-communist,
right,
but not the other side. So he was really both. And the other book is A Handful of Blackberries.
This is a book
so poetic, it seems.
Yes. The Handful of Blackberries, I think, was the first book that Silone wrote when he came back to Italy. He had met a young Irish student in Switzerland, Darina Silone, whom he eventually married. And in October 1944, they made their way back to Italy, and they landed outside of Naples. And eventually, they were married in Rome, and they lived in Rome. And A Handful of Blackberries was, I think, the first book published in the 1950s, the first book that he published when he came back to Italy.
Then there's the story of a humble Christian.
The The story of a humble Christian
is
the story of Celestine V, the only pope to abdicate the papacy.
That comes from Abruzzi.
He came from Abruzzo, exactly. He was a monk, a hermit, at the end of the 13th century, was considered very holy, so holy that people wouldn't leave him alone, so he had to go up into the mountains to flee from people. And in 1294, when the Pope died, the College of Cardinals decided to make him Pope.
Not to make somebody else more politically inclined or controversial people. They chose this humble...
Exactly. There were two Roman families that were competing to be the next Pope. And in order to placate the both of them, since neither one wanted someone from the other family to become Pope, they settled on this Pietro Morone as a compromise. And he eventually becomes Celestine V. But when he gets to Rome, he is simply astonished and discouraged. Discouraged is not a strong enough word, at the corruption, the financial corruption, the religious corruption, and after several months, he abdicates.
Now, Dante mentions in the Divine Comedy Celestine V,
exactly.
Right? Not
Quello che fece il grande rifiuto, he who made the great refusal. And Dante puts him in hell.
In hell for that.
Dante puts him in hell. But for Silone, Celestine V was a great model of the person who could resist the trappings and the temptations of power, and to be honest and to be sincere with himself.
It was a model for him because he was for the poor and for the humble, and so for him was a hero, but for Dante it wasn't not.
Yes, yes.
Okay, probably the last one I'd like to mention is the Fox and the Camellias. This is another a novel?
This was like a short novel, and it's the only one of Silone's novels that's not set in Abruzzo. This was in the 1960s, and the story is of an Abruzzese who has fled Italy and is a farmer in the Ticino canton of Switzerland. And it's a story of intrigue, of fascist spies, the anti-fascist opposition, and a spy who sort of breaks into this anti-fascist group with some very tragic consequences.